having admitted to police that he tortured his victim, 71-year-old retiree Wendy Buckney. After being found guilty of her murder, three-time killer Brian Whitelock, 57, barked at the jury, "I hope you all suffer a brain injury," and "I hope you all rot." Sarah Mayhew's greatest misfortune in life was, according to the judge of the sentencing relating to Sarah's murder, to ever have known Gemma Watts, 49, and Steven Sansom, 45. In March 2024, Sansom and Watts joined hands to take Sarah's life to satisfy a Sado-masochistic fantasy of theirs, Sansom having killed once before. Both Sansom and Witelock, whose life sentences for their previous killings clearly meant nothing to them, have since become, as at February 2025, the latest two murderers to get a whole life prison sentence, meaning that they will now never be released. Witelock got his whole life order on the 20th of December 2024, while Sansom got his on the 30th of January 2025. The whole life order is hardly ever used, so to have two imposed in the space of less than 6 weeks. Now, if you're like me, you cheered when you heard in early January 2025 that 43-year-old Urfan Sharif, who got 40 years for battering his 10-year-old daughter Sara to death, had had his face and neck slashed with the lid of a tuna can only days after arriving at HMP Belmarsh. Whatever Sansom gets for that attack, it now clearly won't make the blindest bit of difference to his future. And yes, this means what you think it means. This offence of Sansom's, probably a Section 18 GBH offence, wasn't covered in his sentencing for the murder of Sarah Mayhew, of course, because it had nothing to do with that. It will be dealt with at some point though, I believe. If you're enjoying this video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready, and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. Brian Whitelock's career as a killer began on the 13th of October 2000 when, aged 33, he was hanging out with his brother Glenn, aged 27, and their friend Nicholas Morgan, aged 29, over at Glenn's. This was in Swansea, Wales, and this was, by all accounts, a drink and drugs party. In response to an alleged argument that unravelled at some point between Witelock and Nicholas, Witelock literally hammered Nicholas to death, bringing his weapon down on his victim's head and face repeatedly, even after Nicholas was dead. When he then placed a blonde wig that he got from somewhere in the house on Nicholas's head, he didn't seem to mind that his victim's skull was totally caved in, or that, having already overkilled his former friend, he clearly wanted to keep humiliating him. Now, I can't tell you whether Glenn saw the attack and just did nothing, or whether he saw it but was so intoxicated that he didn't realise what was happening, because I just don't know. What I have been able to unearth is that by the time Witelock got back with the petrol that he went to buy in order to torch his brother's house to conceal his crime, his brother had passed out due to his intoxication. After nicking all of £1,000 in cash of Glenn's from somewhere in the house, which Glenn had made from his dodgy cigarette selling hustle, and after not giving a shit whether his own brother would die in the fire that he then set, he scarpered off to the pub. Several months on, having long since been caught and sent for trial, Witelock told the court that it was Glenn himself who had set fire to his own home after taking Nicholas's life, and that he had then stayed put in the house afterwards and fallen victim as such to the fire. The 10 years that Witelock got for his brother's manslaughter ran concurrently with the 18 years that he got for Nicholas's murder, the jury having not been the dupes that Witelock had clearly been counting on them to be, and having easily found the defendant guilty. Witelock's first period of parole, which came in January 2019, came to an end virtually 2 years later, December 2020, when he assaulted a security guard at a shopping centre while both drunk and high, Valium having been the DR-G that he had consumed both on that occasion and on the occasion of his first two killings. He stayed on the Valium and on the booze. After his second release from prison, which came in October 2021, the parole board having deemed him a low-risk offender. Yeah, I know. Witelock funded his addictions, in part at least, with the odd jobs that he often did for an elderly neighbour of his down in Swansea again, by the name of Wendy Buckney, to whom he had grown close and who he described to others as being like a second mother to him. For her own part, having two stepsons that she totally cherished, Wendy was from a large extended family who expressed to her their serious concerns about her allowing an ex-con into her life. Wendy, however, readily rebuffed the words of warning coming from her loved ones, saying that everyone deserves a second chance. As we know, however, Witelock was, at this point, actually on his third chance, and I'll tell you now that Wendy's horrific murder was 100% preventable. Witelock breached the conditions of his licence repeatedly, for instance, by entering prohibited parts of Swansea, and, of course, by drinking and taking Valium. In August of 2022 itself, the month when Witelock savaged Wendy, Whitelock had both the police and the ambulance service called on him multiple times for ranting and raving in the street due to being severely under the influence. The police, though, just kept letting him go, while the probation service, who were, I think, notified of Whitelock's many licence violations, took no action against him. I have no idea whether either any of the police officers or any of the probation service officials involved in Witelock's case have been subject to or are going to be subject to any sort of formal inquiry regarding their obvious failings in this case. But for the failings of those two sets of authorities, I'd say Wendy would still be alive. Witelock attributes the following acts of his to the effects of a brain injury. He likes going on about brain injuries, doesn't he? And to the effects, of course, of his excessive consumption of lager and Valium. On the 22nd of August 2022, on having Wendy trustingly let him into her home, Witelock used a knife, a broken table leg and some MDF shelving from Wendy's house to stab and beat Wendy all over her body and face. His act of stripping both Wendy and himself naked led the judge to conclude that there had been a sexual element to Witelock's savage attack on his neighbour. The pathologist defined 70 injuries from head to toe of Wendy's body, but affirmed that there were numerous others and that he simply couldn't keep count. Parts of Wendy's body had been skinned. Her nose, upper lip and underlying cheek were partly detached. There was an injury to the back of the left side of her head, which left the bone of her skull exposed. There was bleeding to the whites of her eyes. Her arms had fatty tissue and muscle exposed. Some of the weapons that Witelock had used on her left marks on her body which showed their shape. Likewise, splinters of wood and other materials were embedded in some parts of Wendy's body. Wendy's left cheekbone was fractured into 3 pieces and her right leg was broken. Her body was found face down on the floor with clothes and other objects heaped on top of it. Her sofa was standing upended, while bits of Wendy's flesh were later found attached to the wall and to the ceiling. Witelock reports that his elderly, overweight and slightly disabled victim had begged him to stop, but that he'd ignored her. In 2000, under the influence of drink and drugs, Witelock battered Nicholas Morgan to death and beyond, and then dressed his shattered skull with a wig. 22 years later, under the influence of drink and drugs, he stabs and batters Wendy Buckney to death and beyond, and then piles a load of clothes and other random items onto her corpse. In both murders, the man sought, if you like, to sustain the sense of power and dominance that killing offered him even after the killing was done. That is explained by the things that he did to his victims even after they were dead, placing objects on them, dressing them, decorating them, playing with them. And he did those things because he loved having the power and wanted to hold on to it, of course, for as long as possible. The man's an animal. On Christmas Eve 1998, at the age of 19, Steven Sansom got into a minicab, got to his destination, then got out the 12cm kitchen knife that he had brought with him and plunged it so far into the neck of the driver, whose name I couldn't trace, sorry, that it reached the bone of the man's cervical spine. This was the fatal wound of all the wounds that Sansom inflicted on his victim, including ones to the man's ear, throat and shoulder, plus the defensive wounds that the man sustained to his hands. Having left the scene, Sansom then returned to the vehicle and cut the cable to the radio microphone to ensure that the dying man couldn't call for help. And this was all for the 25 quid that the perpetrator had found in the driver's wallet, which he had stolen. Sansom was released on licence in December 2019 after serving more than 20 years for both murder and robbery, having pleaded guilty to both charges. Sansom had briefly dated 38-year-old Sarah Mayhew, who was mother to a 12-year-old and a 15-year-old, years before he and Gemma Watts took her life. Sarah is how Sansom met Watts. She introduced the two to one another in the summer of 2023 and the two started hooking up. Sansom and Watts were from Croydon, South London. At the point when Watts started suggesting that she and Sansom should take their shared love of BDSM, a mutual trait that each had discovered in the other early on, to the level of killing a woman and then having sex together with Sansom covered in the woman's blood, for instance. Watts knew that Sansom was out on licence for murder and that he had, as such, the capacity to fulfil her fantasy. Sansom's WhatsApp message to Watts from the 11th of September 2023, which said, quote, "Everything looks like meat now, don't they? A plaything, something to cut, something to bleed. They all look different now," unquote, leaves us in no doubt as to his own enthusiasm for this idea, he and Watts subsequently discussing cannibalising their victim and suggesting how the person would taste. Sansom assured Watts that nothing was off limits for him, but I should say at this point that there is no evidence that either Sansom or Watts actually did cannibalise Sarah. After all Sarah's body parts were found spread all over South London, so In the sentencing hearing, the judge stressed that the WhatsApp messages make it clear that Sansom and Watts were equally complicit in what became their real-life plan of murder. It wasn't a case of one party's will being overborne by the other. It's noteworthy that in the process of identifying potential victims for their fucked up murder plan, Watts stated of one particular candidate that she knew that Sansom could do no more than to have sex with her. He wasn't allowed to murder her. While Sansom had said earlier that absolutely anything was on, Watts, in contrast, had limits clearly to her Sado-masochistic indulgences and clearly had the expectation that Sansom would respect her limits. The thing is, when the two eventually settled on Sarah Mayhew as their target, Watts didn't set any limits for their acts against her. Quite on the contrary. By November 2023, Watts was anticipating getting Sarah into Sansom's flat and cutting her throat. When Sansom replied that he would try to get Sarah to come round if she, Watts that is, wanted him to, Watts answered, quote, "Only if it's a deal that she's not leaving in one piece," unquote. In the conversation that followed, Sansom told Watts that he could slit Sarah's throat over her face. The conversation after that turned to whether Sansom had the tools, to which Watts replied, quote, "Great minds think alike," unquote. While it took a lot of coaxing from Sansom to get Sarah to stop by, when Sarah finally agreed, her visit coming on the 8th of March 2024, she was expecting a night of sex. She was never seen again. When the following day, 9th of March, Watts greeted a neighbour of hers after taking her dog for a walk, she showed no signs of nervousness or worry. Neither did Sansom, this same neighbour, a witness, describing Sansom's mood on that day as chirpy. The day after that, 10th of March, Sansom got busy on Sarah's body with the hacksaw and the other tools that he had bought that very morning, and soon enough, Sarah's body was sitting in a set of bags and in a suitcase awaiting removal. Having murdered Sarah 2 days before, you see, Sansom and Watts were only preparing to get rid of her body now. They kept it in their flat for 2 whole days. Anyway. Between April and May 2024, Sarah's body parts began turning up in areas of South London, Roden and Mitcham, both being very close to Croydon, where Watts and Sansom were living, being the main 2 places that Sarah's killers used as dumping sites. Other than taking Sarah's life, what Watts and Sansom did to Sarah just isn't known. Neither Sansom nor Watts would say, and with the decomposition and dismemberment of the body, the pathologist couldn't trace the harm inflicted on Sarah. At the sentencing hearing, where Watts got her 30-year minimum term and where Sansom got his sentence, whose details you know, the judge condemned the 2 killers' lack of remorse, citing words from a letter from Watts to Sansom saying, quote, "Love lasts, my evil twin," unquote. Another 2 savage animals. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.